Hey, everybody. It is Monday, May 5th, Cinco de Mayo. You're listening to the Moon News Podcast. I'm Moshe Wanunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Jill, fun fact. Cinco de Mayo, a bigger deal and more celebrated in the U.S. than in Mexico.
Really?
Yeah, it's like,
That's weird.
it commemorates a Mexican victory over the French back in the 19th century. Mexican Independence Day, by the way, is in September. And like for some reason, while it's celebrated in certain places in Mexico, it's like culturally a much bigger deal here in the U.S. As you can probably tell today if you head to any Mexican restaurant or bar near you. Cinco de Mayo, big day, big day.
I think Cinco de Mayo, in fairness to, I guess, Americans here, it's a big deal to maybe like 20-somethings.
Jill, in the same way that St. Patrick's Day is also a big holiday for 20-somethings who want to celebrate in a certain way, it is a day to celebrate Mexican culture and heritage, but typically, the kids, ages 18 to 30, it's more of a drinking holiday.
Either way, Moshe, I'm guessing we're going to learn more about it in On This Day in History.
You got that, Rachel.
How could I have guessed? Okay, then let's get to some headlines here. President Trump making some big headlines during an interview this weekend, from immigration enforcement to whether he'll run for a third term. We've got the highlights.
Jill, as we started recording, you were listening. I think you were an hour into the hour and 20 interview that he did. Yeah, a lot of headlines from the president. His second major network interview in just a few days. So we will try to run through a couple of the highlights.
To business news, the Oracle of Omaha stepping down at the age of 94. So what's next for Warren Buffett's more than $1 trillion empire? Plus more fallout from the delays at Newark Airport. Now a major airline slashing flights right before the busy summer travel season because of a shortage of air traffic controllers.
Jill, a lot of issues if you are flying into or out of Newark Airport. Beware.
Overseas, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky saying no thanks to Vladimir Putin's ceasefire plan. A terror attack thwarted at a Lady Gaga concert in Brazil. What we know about it.
Yeah, Jill, on Copacabana Beach, nearly 2.5 million people were in attendance.
A look at President Trump's executive order calling for an end to funding for NPR and PBS. Yes, we're talking Sesame Street. But where do they get most of their funding from anyway? And there is a brand new town in Texas. Why it is a big win for Elon Musk.
SpaceX has its own city with a bust of Elon Musk in the center of it.
And the most exciting 2 minutes in sports, Sovereignty pulls out a big win at the Kentucky Derby, but not without some controversy. And Moshe is on this day in history.
Jill, in addition to the aforementioned Cinco de Mayo, we'll take a look at an artist known for saying his name at the beginning of nearly every song he sings. You know who I'm talking about, Rachel?
I don't. Is it a rap? Is it a rapper?
Jason Derulo.
Oh my God. Wait, Moshe, my husband's dentist is like Jason Carulo or something, and all I do is anytime he goes, I'm like, Jason Carulo. Yeah.
Now you put two and two together. Anyway, we'll give you the number of songs we think he has said his name at the beginning of.
All right, President Trump sitting down for a wide-ranging interview on NBC's Meet the Press on Sunday. It's his second major network interview in less than a week. And he made a number of headlines on everything from the rule of law to the economy to the possibility of a third Trump term. So let's start with a question from NBC's Kristen Welker. She asked the president about the case of Kilmar Obrego Garcia. He is the man who the government admits that it mistakenly deported to El Salvador. The Supreme Court ruled last month in a 9-0 decision that the government needs to facilitate his return. Welker asked Trump about that, saying several judges and Secretary of State Marco Rubio have said citizens and non-citizens are entitled to due process under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, meaning that they are entitled to go before a judge to make their case to stay in the United States before being deported. Let's listen to how Trump responds.
Your Secretary of State says everyone who's here, citizens and non-citizens, deserve due process. Do you agree, Mr. President?
I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know.
Well, the Fifth Amendment says
I don't know.
as
It seems it might say that, but if you're talking about that, then we'd have to have 1 million or 2 million or 3 million trials. We have thousands of people that are some murderers and some drug dealers and some of the worst people on earth.
Welker then asked if he is required to follow the Constitution, and he said, quote, "I have brilliant lawyers that work for me, and they are going to obviously follow what the Supreme Court said."
So this comment got, understandably, a lot of attention, Jill, in that very lengthy interview. He remains adamant that he's going to do whatever it takes to ship undocumented migrants out of the country. In that interview and last week, he said it's inconceivable to have millions of cases in court, even though, of course, that's the law, insisting that he needs the power to be able to quickly remove people he says are murderers and drug dealers. And so he doubled down on that over the weekend, acknowledging again that the Constitution might say that there's due process. By the way, it does say that. That's the Fifth Amendment, but that he doesn't want to have 3 million trials. Now, it's not going to be trials, but you will have hearings, and there is a backlog, right? There's not enough judges, too many people to deport. But a reminder that the Constitution does not refer to citizens. The Constitution refers to peoples inside the U.S. It's very specific in that way. And so the Supreme Court, as you mentioned, ruled 9-0 that due process, the Fifth Amendment, applies to people here, legally, illegally, good, bad, everybody. And so we don't just take the government's word for it. We need a judge to hear it. So it's interesting in the Abrego Garcia case that we're talking about here, because that's sort of taking the center stage, that, you know, the government admits they weren't supposed to deport him. There was a previous judge that said, listen, he's deportable, but just not back to his home country of El Salvador, because there's a gang that there's evidence that he may face violence there from this gang down there. Upon recognition that they messed up here, they easily could have brought him back and then deported him the right way. But they decided to put up this fight here because the administration sees this as a winning battle for them. They see Abrego Garcia as a bad dude. They see this as an opportunity to enable Democrats to look like they're defending somebody who allegedly does have connections to MS-13. You know, there have been various things that have come out against him in regards to domestic violence. Nonetheless, Democrats assert, no, he deserves due process, and the government acknowledges that they messed up here. So nonetheless, back to the interview here, the answer causes understandable concern, because it's not typical you hear a president who swears an oath to the Constitution, to protect the Constitution, to defend the Constitution, to follow the Constitution, for him to say, yeah, it might be there, but I listened to my DOJ and I don't interpret it that way. Now, ultimately, this will come down to his Justice Department as this case goes back to the Supreme Court, asking for an interpretation of what facilitate is. Remember, the Supreme Court said you must facilitate the release of Abrego Garcia back to the U.S. They say that facilitate means we provide a plane, and it's up to El Salvador to return him. So we haven't gotten clarity as this has gone through the lower courts again, and we'll see what happens there. But again, not typical. We've never heard this before from a president in modern history. Typically, if an interviewer said, will you follow the Constitution? The answer is, of course. In this case, Trump sort of has his way of saying, well, I interpret this differently, but I will listen to the Justice Department. I will listen to the Supreme Court ultimately, but it's going to probably take a second round here. It comes as the president keeps signing additional executive orders because he's trying to increase the pace of deportations. So far, his deportations are falling short of his expectations. He's trying to ramp things up. On Friday, the Trump administration filed a lawsuit against the state of Colorado, the city of Denver, accusing them of limiting their cooperation with Immigration and Customs Enforcement and impeding federal immigration actions.
Welker also asked Trump about tariffs and the economy, the president dismissing concerns about costs going up on many products. And he repeated something that he said last week, that the tariffs could mean that girls in America have fewer dolls, a reference to the fact that a majority of toys come from China. So he said instead of girls getting 30 dolls for Christmas, for example, maybe they just get 3 or 4.
2. He said 2, Jill. I know this because Olivia, after losing her doll, she now has 3 versions of that doll. And I was like, well, that's one more than the president says I should be buying my daughter.
Yeah, I wanted to say, talk to my 6.5-year-old about how big of a deal it is to only get 1 or 2 dolls. So Moshe, in the interview, he kept talking, though, about dolls, but ignoring concerns about other items like furniture, appliances, apparel, batteries, a whole host of things that come from China and other countries. Welker also asked him if the tariffs will be permanent, and he said, potentially. He said he wants to encourage domestic manufacturing. He says he's trying to make deals with countries. And so, no, they are not going to remove the tariffs from China unless there is a deal. Welker also asked Trump twice if he is okay with a recession in the short term if things work out for the economy in the long run. He downplayed recession fears. He said, quote, "This is a transition period. I think that we are going to do fantastically." He blamed former President Biden for the bad parts of the economy, despite a Commerce Department report released last week that indicated that the economy shrank in the first quarter of 2025 on Trump's watch.
Yeah, back to the Doll thing for a second. I mean, I think one of the criticisms he's getting, even from Republicans, and we mentioned a number of them, including most of Wall Street, most folks in business, is that China is the manufacturing hub of the world. We buy more than $500 billion worth of goods from China, and there's a warning already in the coming weeks that we will start to see some empty shelves in stores. And there's a number of businesses, we've heard from a number of you, who depend on China for manufacturing. It's just, that's what they've become over the last 30 years. So this isn't about dolls or having less dolls, but ultimately, something much larger than that, given just how much stuff, materials, that go into things and then how much is manufactured there, depending on how long these tariffs last. Now, what was notable in this interview is that he sort of softened his tone on China. He did admit that he'll probably have to lower the 145% tariffs, because this effectively means that we're not buying anything from each other, because then China returned fire with 125% tariff. So effectively, there's a trade embargo between the two largest economies in the world. The bet that Trump is making is that it's going to hurt China more and quicker. And it's interesting because we're already seeing some signs of trouble in China, Jill, in the past week. This is hard to glean because Chinese state media doesn't cover these things, because anything that's bad for China, they don't cover, and there's no First Amendment or anything remotely like that in China. But we are seeing increasing evidence and reporting that there are protests at a number of Chinese factories. Millions of people in China are set to lose their jobs right now because we've stopped ordering things from there. Our companies have, our importers have, because they don't want to pay these absurd tariffs. And so Trump's bet is that it's going to be more painful for China. They're going to have people protesting in the streets. Unemployment is going to go sky high, and the Chinese economy can't take it. And that he's betting that Americans can deal with a shortage of items, potentially, again, the doll example, but a number of other things. Now, depending on how long this goes, we did mention last week that the majority of parts for air conditioners comes from China. Well, what is that going to mean in the middle of summer when, more and more Americans don't have air conditioning potentially if their air conditioners break down and their suppliers can't get parts. So, right now it's hard to tell who is going to have to blink first here. Both sides will probably say that the other side blinked. You have seen indications that both sides are sort of ready for talks here, but they want to say that the other side came to them. But you did again see a sort of softening tone here, a realization, an admission, frankly, from Trump that they can't continue, tariffs cannot continue at this level. And given what we're hearing from ports, given what we're hearing warning signs about, potential supply shortages here, well, I'd be shocked, Jill, if by Memorial Day in just a few weeks from now, the 145% tariffs are still there. I would presume they'll be lower than that. As far as a couple other headlines we monitored from that interview, something notable. He did say that he plans on ending his presidency in 2028 at the end of 2 terms. Now, that typically would not be news. That is what the Constitution says. But Trump has indicated in recent months, including in interviews, that he wasn't joking about a 3rd term, that he was going to find a way to have a 3rd term, despite the fact that the Constitution limits a president to only 2 terms. So acknowledging that reality, just as his family is selling Trump 2028 hats on his website, was notable, I think, in this interview. And then, one other Trump headline from the weekend, Jill, the Trump Instagram account and Twitter account and the White House Instagram account have become sort of meme accounts during this presidency. They'll put videos and photos up of things that happened, but they also like to put up memes, which is new. And so one thing they posted on Saturday was an AI picture depicting Trump as the next pope. He put that up over the weekend. He did say last week, when asked who should be the next pope, he said, "I would like to be the next pope." Now, for the record, Trump is not Catholic. Technically, all Catholic males are eligible. They typically only pick, historically, cardinals. But he decided to put that photo up. So people are saying oh my God. So I've heard from some Catholics over the weekend, some who said, haha, some who said, this is deeply insulting to my faith. And so Cardinal Timothy Dolan of New York, who's there in Rome right now, will be voting on the next pope, is eligible to be the next pope, but probably won't be in all likelihood. He said that he hopes Trump was not directly involved in posting that because he found that disconcerting.
Okay, now to a major development in the business world. Famed investor Warren Buffett saying Saturday that he will step down from his role leading Berkshire Hathaway later this year. He made those comments during his annual address in Omaha, Nebraska. It surprised Wall Street, his shareholders, and even his hand-picked replacement, Buffett is 94 years old. He built Berkshire Hathaway from a company that made suit linings in the 1960s, and he built it into one of the world's most successful investment companies ever. The textile business ended in 1985, but they kept the Berkshire name. They now own 189 operating businesses and dozens of stocks. It became the first U.S. non-tech company to reach a $1 trillion market capitalization and now has a market value of $1.15 trillion. Buffett has been CEO for 55 years. That makes him the longest serving CEO of any S&P 500 company. He is worth $166 billion as of Friday, making him the fifth richest person in the world. When he made that announcement at Berkshire Hathaway's annual shareholder meeting in Omaha, he was met with a several-minute standing ovation from the crowd. Let's hear some of that.
The time has arrived where Greg should become the chief executive officer of the company at year end. I would still hang around and could conceivably be useful in a few cases, but the final word would be what Greg said. And Greg doesn't know anything about this until what he's hearing right now. But that, yeah.
So the Greg who he mentions there, Jill, is Gregory Abel. He's been the vice chairman of Berkshire's non-insurance companies since 2018. We've known for a few years now that he was going to be the successor. But it's funny, only at Berkshire Hathaway with a 94-year-old Warren Buffett is a retirement announcement a surprise that a 94-year-old is retiring. People are just like, you assume that Buffett's going to go forever. One of his longtime deputies, Charlie Munger, actually worked until his final days at 99 years old a couple of years ago. By the way, when we mentioned Berkshire Hathaway, it's a holding company. It has 189 operating businesses. So that includes NetJets, Dairy Queen, BNSF Railroad. They have a lot of things. And I love the origin story of Buffett because effectively in 1965, he was a shareholder in Berkshire. He agreed to sell back some of his shares. It was a textile company that was struggling at the time. And he was selling the shares for $11.50, but it was actually only paid $11.37. That upset him, that like they were burning him by a few cents. So he decided to just buy as many shares as he could of the company and take over the company. And so he basically out of just like pure anger and created this incredible business. Again, $1.1 trillion business. He's at times has been the richest man in the world. Now he's the fifth richest man in the world, which just gives you a sense of what $166 billion in value gets you these days. Funny enough, at that announcement over the weekend, only his kids who sit on the board were aware of it. He actually surprised Gregory Abel. Like who was like next to him being like, this is a surprise to Greg, but like, I'm doing this right now. I'm done. I'll be around. You can ask me questions, but he's taken over the business here. Buffett, an icon in the business world, an icon in the investing world. He has a lot of truths, including don't invest in anything that you like don't know what their value is, that you don't know what it does. This was advice that's often used around Bitcoin and some other stuff, which is like, if you don't quite understand it or you don't understand its value, like don't invest in it. So like he's a guy who invests in basics. There's a lot of like really interesting, aspects of his life, including that he drinks Coca-Cola every day, eats McDonald's every day. He's lived into his 90s. He lives in the same house that he bought in 1958. At the time, he paid $31,000 for it. I think it's worth just over $1 million today. Nonetheless, he's worth $166 billion, right? So it's still, notable kind of how humble he is. He has promised to donate over 99% of his wealth throughout his life, and at the time of his death, so far he's given about $62 billion away in charity. Big deal in the business world that Warren Buffett stepping away here.
Time for the speed read from CNN. Air traffic control staffing issues continue to cause major delays over the weekend for passengers at Newark Airport. That is one of the big three airports that serve the New York City area. At least 262 flights were delayed. At least another 89 flights were canceled at Newark on Sunday alone. That is according to the flight tracking site FlightAware. So we are now at thousands of delays over the last week, with hundreds of flights canceled. The FAA's flight delay info website attributes the reason for the delays to staffing issues. We're also getting information about equipment and radar issues as well, in addition to lackluster ATC staffing. The Transportation Secretary, Sean Duffy, acknowledged in a press conference last week that there's a shortage of about 3,000 air traffic controllers in the United States. The Department of Transportation has rolled out financial incentives to hire more controllers and keep the ones that they do have working until they hit retirement age.
Jill, and what's notable about air traffic controllers is they can retire at the age of 56, just due to the stress of that profession. They have an earlier retirement age. But right now, given the shortage, you have a situation where many of them are working 6 days a week, can't take vacation time. They're working like 10-hour days. And this shortage, by the way, goes back a few years here. We've been asked about whether this was due to DOGE cuts. A reminder, DOGE initially was going to offer those buyouts to air traffic controllers. Sean Duffy, the transportation secretary under Trump, actually fought back against DOGE. There has been some reporting that he and Rubio were sort of the two people that have been pushing back on Elon Musk in some of the attempts by DOGE to just cut across the board. Duffy did admit in a press conference last week that there are cracks in the system, and what you're seeing happen at Newark Airport right now is evidence of what he calls, again, cracks in the system. But he is hoping to supercharge the effort to recruit air traffic controllers, including recruiting military air traffic controllers to come move over to the civilian side. But in the meantime, be cautious about Newark Airport in terms of if you're flying out there or flying into there. United over the weekend announced they're cutting 35 round-trip flights a day from their Newark schedule. They were forced last week. Jill, this must have really sucked for this group. There was a red eye coming from San Francisco to Newark. It turned around over Nebraska and went back to California because Newark's like, yeah, we're not going to be able to take that in. There was another flight, someone had messaged me in the Mo News community that was flying from LA to Newark, turned around and went to San Diego, which again, wrong coast. If you're taking a red-eye flight to the East Coast, the United CEO put out a statement saying that they are canceling those flights in order to protect our customers because they just can't take in that many flights and they don't want to jeopardize safety, right? You know, if you have less air traffic controllers, you're having equipment issues, you don't want to risk it. Now, this reporting from NBC got my attention on Friday. Tom Costello, longtime transportation reporter there, quoted an anonymous official over there at Newark Airport saying it's not a safe situation over there right now. Now, the FAA, for their part, is pushing back on that. They say flying is still safe. We have cut down on flights to accommodate these issues. But this does come as we're getting to the busy summer flying season. Airlines book even more flights. Jill, the Northeast Corridor is already overcommitted on a normal day between flights into LaGuardia, JFK, Philadelphia, Newark, Boston. And so that is a big challenge here. And you can't just like light up a bunch of air traffic controllers overnight. That's a job that requires a lot of training, is a high stress job. Recruitment is challenging. And so it's not clear when these issues are going to be going away here. But certainly what you're seeing happen at Newark is, rising to the top levels of the FAA, the Transportation Department, as they're looking to, figure out what to do here.
I just can't even imagine being on that flight that turned around that but most of the people are probably sleeping and they probably wake up.
They wake up and they're like, we're here already? And it's like, no, you're back in San Francisco. Try again.
It's also incredible given how many airports there are on the East Coast that they couldn't just figure out a different airport that they could land a little bit closer and then they could take an Uber or a train.
Jill, file all those questions for United Airlines.
All right, from the New York Times, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky told reporters he will not adhere to a proposed several-day ceasefire this week. From Russian President Vladimir Putin, he called it a theatrical show. So Putin's proposal suggests a limited 3-day pause of hostilities around May 9th to mark Russia's victory over Germany in World War II. It came after Zelensky agreed to a U.S. proposal for a broader 30-day ceasefire. Zelensky said, quote, "We are simply either at war or Putin shows he is ready to stop shooting as a first step to ending the war." He added that Ukraine would be willing to start the 30-day ceasefire before May 9th if Russia accepts it.
So Zelensky believes Putin's whole offer of a 3-day ceasefire this week is just really an attempt to soothe the concerns of foreign leaders coming to visit Russia this week. Victory Day Parade is a big deal in Russia. May 9th, they defeated the Germans, the Nazis in World War II. And among the guests is Chinese President Xi Jinping. So I think, Putin wanted to do that to ensure, hey, you should come to Russia. It's totally going to be safe. I'm doing this whole ceasefire thing with Ukraine. But the rejection here by Zelensky does come as the relationship with Trump seemed to be improving after that Oval Office disaster shouting match back in February. There was a minerals deal signed between the U.S. and the Ukrainians last week. So we'll see how Trump reacts to this, if he hasn't reacted already overnight by the time you hear this podcast. One thing of note we learned over the weekend, an American Patriot air defense system that had been based in Israel is going to be sent over to Ukraine now following that minerals deal. And it does pave the way for more U.S. military aid, which Trump has severely curtailed here. So now that there's this sort of, Trump has gotten the minerals deal, which means the U.S. will have rights to valuable minerals in Ukraine in exchange for the aid that we're giving. That was a big issue for Trump. It does appear that will hopefully loosen some things as far as the Ukrainians are concerned to get more U.S. military equipment, and that Patriot missile battery appears to be evidence of that.
From the Associated Press, Brazilian police said on Sunday that they thwarted a bomb attack that was planned for a free Lady Gaga concert in Rio de Janeiro this weekend. The show drew over 2 million people to Copacabana Beach Saturday night. Authorities say they got a tip that a radical group was operating under the guise of Lady Gaga's fans, calling themselves the Little Monsters, as many of her fans refer to themselves. Instead, they were promoting hate speech against the LGBT community. They were recruiting teenagers to detonate homemade explosive devices at her concert. Police conducted over a dozen search and seizure warrants across multiple states, and they arrested 2 people.
So we're still waiting on Brazilian authorities to say exactly why they were targeting the concert, but she is popular among LGBT audiences, and apparently this group was very anti-LGBT, and it does come as in a number of countries, they've tried to improve security at concerts, especially after that tragedy at the Ariana Grande concert in England killed 22 people when ISIS committed a suicide bombing there back in 2017. You also, of course, had that mass shooting, the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history at the Harvest Festival in Vegas, where 60 people were killed by gunmen. That was at a concert that Jason Aldean was performing at. Of course, you had the Nova Music Festival in Israel on October 7th, where Hamas murdered hundreds of people and took additional folks hostage. But we should note that, again, it appears here the Brazilians were able to prevent this tragedy on Copacabana Beach. And the concert over the weekend, Jill, had about 2.5 million people at it, one of the largest concerts in world history.
From NBC News, a follow-up on one of the latest executive orders issued by President Trump last week. This is one to end federal funding to NPR and PBS over concerns of liberal bias. The order instructs the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a publicly funded nonprofit that was allocated $535 million every year from Congress, to stop giving money to these public media companies. A fact sheet accompanying the order accuses NPR and PBS of fueling, quote, partisanship and left-wing propaganda, pointing to specific coverage like a PBS movie about a transgender boy and a Sesame Street town hall about racism.
Jill, the White House fact sheet has about 100 different examples. They also note a PBS story about whether the thumbs up emoji is racist, a recent PBS panel about white privilege, dozens of examples in the White House fact sheet of stories they believe are too woke or too liberal as far as they're concerned.
It also called out an NPR editor's findings that registered Democrats outnumber Republicans 87-0 in the newsroom's editorial positions. You might recall we covered that editor. His name was Uri Berliner. He was pushed out for calling out the liberal bias at NPR. At the same time, the idea of funding the organizations have to do with larger issues here. Nearly all of our media is for profit. So the aim of funding public broadcasting was to ensure that there is also educational programming. Anywhere from 8 to 17% of NPR and PBS is federally funded, and that gives money to local newsrooms around the country that are doing on-the-ground community reporting. It costs each American, on average, a little over $1.50 a year to fund the CPB. The rest of that budget comes from donations and corporate sponsors. It's very likely the public media companies are going to challenge all of this in the courts. Since President Trump doesn't technically have the power to kill their funding, Congress already allocated their money for the next 3 years, and Congress would have to actually vote to take it away.
Yeah, that's something the White House is going to call on Congress to do. It's something called a rescission package. It requires a majority of the House, majority of the Senate. Now, Republicans do have majorities in both, but keep in mind that not all Republicans, even if they have issues with NPR and PBS, agree that the government should be retracting all funding from them. So for now, this is just sort of a declaration by Trump. The funding continues through 2027, though he is having a legal fight with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, where he's trying to fire several people. They have filed a lawsuit saying he doesn't have the authority to do that. So yet one of the other legal cases that we're watching here, this is an issue that goes back decades. Nearly every Republican presidential candidate, basically except for Gerald Ford, based on my research, has called for the government to stop funding NPR and PBS. This was initially a plan rolled out by Lyndon Baines Johnson back in 1967. Even Mitt Romney, who was sort of on the more moderate edge of Republicans, said back in the 2012 campaign that he loves a big bird, but ultimately he thinks the government should not be spending money, tens of millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars on PBS. Jill, as you noted, anywhere from 80 to 90% of NPR and PBS funding comes from, what's the expression? From viewers like you and the Annenberg Foundation and the Bloomberg Foundation. So, ultimately in this case, if this was to somehow happen, they would, have to double down and rely on, you donating to get that tote bag or the DVD of the Yanni of the Acropolis concert. I'm dating myself based on the last time I watched
Like a
PBS funding telethons. Jill, you mentioned that NPR editor's findings, Uri Berliner. He's over at the Free Press now, and he was sort of a whistleblower when it comes to just the very liberal staffing situation at NPR, the decision-making at NPR. Also being scrutinized right now is the new NPR CEO, Catherine Maurer. She had a really horrendous experience testifying on Capitol Hill recently, trying to defend the funding. And I mean, she has a whole litany of tweets, including having called Trump deranged. Now, again, there's a separation between the business side and the editorial side at NPR, but ultimately just really bad optics for NPR to have someone who is very, very, very progressive and liberal and trying to make the arguments that they need to right now when it comes to their coverage. Nonetheless, I should say personally, we rely here at Mo News, among the many publications and media outlets we turn to for reliable coverage is NPR and PBS. I have certainly admittedly seen bias in some of their coverage, but some would argue, many would argue, even some Republicans would argue, that's one thing, but cutting funding completely because of that is another thing. At the same time, this is one of the many things, like cutting the Department of Education, that many Republicans have said they would do. They didn't do because they didn't want to have those fights. That Trump, in Trump 2, is willing to try, willing to do, willing to deal with the legal ramifications of. And keep in mind that when you look at the audiences here, Democrats are 3 times more likely to get their news and trust NPR and PBS than Republicans. So Trump sees this as a very safe issue when it comes to his voters.
From the Washington Post, there's a brand new town in Texas, and it's a big victory for Elon Musk. Texas voters on Saturday approved the creation of a new municipality named Starbase, centered around Musk's SpaceX launch facility in Boca Chica, Texas. The move formalizes the growing community that has developed around the aerospace company's operations in the region. It also aims to improve infrastructure and public services there. More than 3/5 of the nearly 300 voters who were eligible to cast ballots in the election work for SpaceX.
Yeah.
So if they didn't vote for it, who is? I mean,
so Jill, that vote, according to the final vote, 212 to 6. I don't know who the 6 people were who voted against becoming this municipality, but nonetheless, this 1.5 square mile southern tip of Texas, nestled on the Mexican border there, is now an independent town. The mayor, I should note, and the 2 commissioners, 2 city commissioners, all of them are employees at SpaceX. They broke ground, the company did, on Boca Chica just about 11 years ago, back in 2014. They've brought about 3,000 jobs to the region. Now, SpaceX and Elon Musk haven't said specifically what the purpose is here of incorporating a city around the operations, but they have had issues, bureaucracy restrictions around SpaceX tests and rocket launches. They have to constantly get permission from authorities to close a highway and shut down beach access every time they do a launch there for rocket launches. So I think they just wanted to basically have their own city so they could just do it themselves and not have to get permission for it. There have been some concerns about their environmental impact here. The EPA did fine SpaceX about $150,000 last year for violating the Clean Water Act. They discharged hundreds of thousands of gallons of wastewater into wetlands in the area without a proper permit. But nonetheless, Elon Musk, who's had a tough go at it these past few months, I mean, self-inflicted, right, as the head of Doge and some various things that he said, this is probably his first big win in a while, outside of course, the various cuts and stuff that he's been able to do within the government.
And finally, from Blood Horse Magazine, Sovereignty won the 151st Kentucky Derby on Saturday at Louisville's Churchill Downs, overcoming a muddy track to defeat the 3-1 favorite Journalism. Yes, journalism was the name of the horse. The race unfolded with its early leader, Citizen Bull, eventually fading. Following Sovereignty and Journalism to battle in the final stretch, Sovereignty pulled ahead in the end to win by several lengths. The race set records for both attendance and betting. More than 147,000 people showed up to the track, and nearly $235 million was bet on the race.
Jill, some people in MAGA world and on the right are enjoying the win of Sovereignty over Journalism. Journalism coming in second place in the race, Jill, not in our hearts here at the Mo News podcast. But I should note, Sovereignty is owned by an international team founded by Sheikh Mohammed, the ruler of Dubai, who had been 0 for 13 at the Kentucky Derby until this year. Fun fact, Jill, I got to spend time with Sheikh Mo in Kentucky with his horses back when I was at Bloomberg TV running international coverage. He was very much getting into horse racing at the time. You know, they have unlimited sums of money to play with there in Dubai. This has been a passion of him for his whole life. So I got to spend time with him in Kentucky and then also produce some coverage of him with his horses in Dubai about 15 years ago when he was first getting into it. So this is a big deal in that world. You know, his horse coverage makes the front pages there in Dubai. Now, this win is not without controversy, and I give credit here to our resident producer, Whitney Lloyd, who's a horse aficionado and, you know, rides herself. By the way, Jill, I didn't know anything about Blood Horse Magazine, but
I'd never heard of it.
So this is, you know, one of the publications in that space. The controversy here that they note is that video replays showed the jockey used his riding crop on the Sovereignty's hindquarters more than 6 times, which is more than is allowed by the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority rules. Basically, he hit the horse too many times. They're going to be reviewing race film here, but in all likelihood, apparently the jockey will be fined, receive a short suspension, but I don't believe they'll be taking the win away from Sovereignty here. Though, you know, we're constantly rooting here for journalism, the horse, and the field. All right, now time for On This Day in History. On this day in 1809, the first woman to receive a U.S. patent, Mary Creese, receives a patent on this day for the technique of weaving straw with silk. It was a process largely used in the creation of hats and other headwear, which is one of my favorite words, Jill. Haberdasher, hat maker.
At first, I thought you meant headwear. And I'm like,
no, headwear's
you can't use it. You could do better, Mo.
Haberdashery. Like, it's a great word, haberdasher. Like, what are you? I'm a haberdasher.
It is.
I make hats.
Great word.
All right. On this day in 1862, Mexico has a big victory at the Battle of Puebla. They repel the French forces of Napoleon III. The victory would become a symbol of a resistance to foreign domination, and it is now celebrated as Cinco de Mayo. On this day in 1945, the only World War II deaths to occur on the continent of the United States, on the main continent, happen on this day. A picnic is taking place in Oregon. 6 people are killed after a Japanese balloon bomb explodes over the picnic. They were the only deaths by enemy action to occur on the continental U.S. Of course, we would have Pearl Harbor, but the only deaths on the continent of the U.S. There was an attempt by the Japanese for a while to send these balloon bombs that would be like floating over the Pacific Ocean, and the goal of the Japanese was to have them explode along the U.S. West Coast. For the most part, they were not very successful, except on this day in history. On this day in 1961, the first U.S. astronaut to travel into space, Alan Shepard, makes a 15-minute suborbital flight in the Freedom 7 spacecraft. He becomes, again, the first U.S. astronaut to travel into space. Of course, Shepard, Alan Shepard, the New Shepard, that's the name of the new Bezos spacecraft that he uses for his Blue Origin company. All right, we end here with a bit of pop culture history. On this day in 1992, House of Pain releases Jump Around 33 years ago today. Jill, I still remember the scene from Mrs. Doubtfire. I think at the beginning of Mrs. Doubtfire, this is the song that's playing. And, you know, I had the VHS. We played the hell out of Mrs. Doubtfire on repeat.
I have seen Mrs. Doubtfire many times. I'm not recalling the jump around scene for whatever reason.
Jill, I think it's like when Robin Williams is having a crazy party at the house that leads to the divorce, and then he gets kicked out, and then of course has to come back to see the kids as Mrs. Doubtfire.
So what the issue is that I guess I've very seldom watched Mrs. Doubtfire from the beginning. I usually catch it kind of in the middle somewhere if
when
it's
Mrs.
on
Doubtfire
TV.
comes on the scene.
Yeah.
Yes. There you go. No, it's like one that's like I Feel Pretty. Anyway, there's so many. It's a great movie. It's a classic film, folks. R.I.P. Robin Williams. Speaking of films, classic films, sort of modern classics. Gladiator on this day premieres in theaters. Russell Crowe. And Gladiator 2 is coming out very soon, Jill, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, Jill, upon Googling this right now, it appears I am mistaken. It came out in November. I think I was going to see it. But yes, Gladiator 2, 24 years later, is out. It's been out for close to 6 months now, and I still haven't seen it. But apparently it's like gotten like $400 million at the theaters. So I guess I have to wait for it to get to streaming.
So my initial thought was, okay, I guess it didn't do so well. If both of us didn't even realize it had been released, but who are we? I guess it crushed it and we didn't even know.
It's there, and I see now apparently Paramount Plus. I can buy it on Apple TV, YouTube TV. There's a few places you can go see Gladiator 2 if you're so inclined. So I guess I'll add it to my list, Jill.
What you're watching this weekend.
And finally, we teased at the beginning. You forgot it for a hot second. But on this day in history, Jason Derulo releases What You Say. Jason Derulo. Jason Derulo. JR. So JR was his producer. And then Jason Derulo, of course, would say his name at the beginning of songs. It was like really good branding for him. And then apparently he stopped for a while, but then he started doing it again because all the songs that he said his name at the beginning of turned out to be big hits for him. So he came back and like, for his like second group of songs at some point, like kept saying his name, but like I guess it wore off at some point, folks. Like, you know, Derulo had in that era of like, what is it, 08, 09, 2010, you couldn't walk down a street without hearing Jason Derulo coming from a car, coming from a club. Jason Derulo.
Wait, so I think it's actually my husband's chiropractor is Jason Derulo. There's someone in his life.
But Jill, you know who also says their names at the beginning of every podcast? Me and you.
Mosh Wanunu.
I need to sing it though to make it more memorable,
exactly.
right? Like I just say it. I'm like, you're listening to Monu's podcast with Mosh Wanunu. If I start doing that, what do you guys think about that?
Will you guys still listen? I don't know. Will anyone take this seriously?
Who is this guy? Does he think he's like Jason Derulo? Only Jason Derulo can do that. Actually, you know who also does that a lot? DJ Khaled. DJ Khaled!
Well, that was my first instinct to go with kind of a rapper or a DJ, because that seems to fit the bill. I forgot about Jason Derulo. You can't even say his name without singing it. It's great marketing.
You cannot. Jason Derulo, good for you, man. You really, like, because like you think about the other people who sort of have those like mid-2000s hits.
You don't know their names anymore.
You remember the songs when they come on, but like you don't remember all their names. But like Jason Derulo, you remember his name, and now he's immortalized on this podcast.
All right, Mosh Wanunu,
Jill Wagner.
We need to work on. We'll figure out something catchy for the
We got to work on it. All right, guys, if you have ideas, let us know.
By the way, yes, we've officially lost our minds. Thank you guys for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It helps us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And review us in the App Store. It really helps.
Don't review our singing. Review the news.
Thanks for listening to the Mo News podcast. Have a fantastic day. I hope you enjoyed.